I'm really very, very happy to be here today. So I took Chris literally, and I was told that I'm going to tell you about oceanography in 25 years, in 50 years, and 100 years. So that's easy, right? You just get the email and it tells you to do that, and you think, oh, piece of cake. Okay. So in order to do that, what I'm first going to do is spend a little bit of time putting us all in the same place of how we think about oceanography. Then I'm not quite the same as Eddie. I'm going to go back in time, but I'm going to go back 25 years. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about today, and then I'll try and project into the future. So let's see. Can I move this? Okay, so let's talk for a second about how oceanographers think of oceanography. Well, I think most of us here would agree that we see the oceans as the planet's memory. This is where vast amounts of heat, of fresh water, and chemicals are stored. And we see the world as that there are key events in Earth's history that are written into the genomes of the organisms and stored in the paleo record. So the challenge we have is just to make sense of all of this, right? That's what we're trying to do. So oceanographers like to think about movements between different reservoirs. So oceanographers think about the interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere. We think about the interaction between the ocean and land. And what we're really interested in ultimately is all these arrows that I'm showing. And all these arrows are showing the interactions between the physics, between the chemistry, the biology, and the geology that sets the stage for how the oceans work. And so we'd like to understand the size of these arrows. But oceanographers don't only think about interactions between the fluid and the atmosphere. We also like to think about the interactions between the liquid Earth and the solid Earth. And so this is depicting the seafloor, where we see the shape of the seafloor that is influenced by major tectonic events. So you see the places where the Earth is splitting apart and new seafloor is being made. These are very active areas where the hydrothermal vents are, and you see these really novel life forms. We also see that this is where, as the new seafloor is made, it's also shoving the seafloor below the continent, and that's where we see the influence of earthquakes. So oceanographers try and make sense of all of this, but we're also very influenced by new technology that allows us to study this, and we're also very influenced by what's going on around in the external world. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that now. So in order for me to think, so imagine being given the task of thinking about things in 25, 50, and 100 years from now. You have to kind of calibrate what 25 years are. And so the way that I calibrated 25 years, was to focus on me. So here I am, as a graduate student, beginning graduate student, on the deck of a ship as a brand new oceanographer, barefoot, and you can see why I chose this field. And what was I thinking about then? What I was very influenced by that in that time was this concept of dilution is the solution. And what do I mean by that? It was seen in these, I was influenced by earlier times where the oceans were seen as infinite, right? So where do you deal with your waste? Well, you put it in the ocean because it's infinitely diluted. Right? So that's where we would put the waste, our sewage waste, that's where we would put it because the oceans are infinite. We can discuss how right that idea was. We also, at the time, what was the major technological development, at least in my field, which is phytoplankton ecology, was the advent of using flow cytometers. So flow cytometers were developed in the medical field as a way to make measurements of individual cells. My thesis advisor had just started using flow cytometry at sea as a way of looking at the individual cells, the individual phytoplankton cells. So we moved from an era where we were looking at bulk chlorophyll to looking at individual cells. Now this greatly advanced because prior to that, we'd really been restricted to microscopic counts, which is, we see the beauty of that, but there's only so many samples you could do back then. So suddenly with flow cytometry, we could measure the phytoplankton distributions in the world's oceans. And so that's really what was going on. The things that we're not thinking about in these days, Prochlorococcus, Proteorhodopsin, what are those things? And I guarantee you there was not a single student that was using the word meta in their everyday language. Yeah, so meta what? Okay, so then what's happened in those 25 years since then? Well, there's a lot that's happened. This is a record of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere since when I showed you, 1985, to today. So in 85, the concentrations were at about 340 parts per million. Now we've crossed this threshold of 400 parts per million in our atmosphere. These are concentrations that we haven't seen for 20 million years, at least. So that was one thing that's happened in that interim. The other thing that's happened in that interim is rising temperatures. So again, in green is the 25 years since, and so we start seeing the impacts of these external forces on what's going on within the ocean. And then, so these are atmospheric levels. How do we see what's going on in the oceans? There was another technological advance. There's many technological advances in this period, but the one that I wanted to mention is one that we heard earlier by Emmanuel, I believe, was talking about the Argo floats. So these Argo floats are these instruments that you can put out in the ocean. There's currently about 3,800 of them in the oceans. They drift at 1,000 meters for about 10 days. Then they go down to 2,000 meters. Then they profile all the way back to the surface. When they get to the surface, they send the data via satellite. So in these kinds of measurements, you're getting some of the basic parameters, temperature and salinity, and as Emmanuel said to us, we're also putting new sensors on these as well. But just from the temperature and salinity, we can also see what's happening with temperature in the ocean. So this is a really nice study that was in 2012, where they compared the data that's come from the Argo floats from this period from 2004 to 2010, and compared it to the temperature measurements that were made with the Challenger. So this sort of harkens to what you guys are going to be seeing in talks in the future, harkening back to the data from the Tara. So 135 years before that was the Challenger expedition. You see the cruise tracks. Everywhere that it's red is an area that the temperature over this 2004-2010 period is higher than where it was in the Challenger expedition. And overall, at the surface ocean, it's about 0.6 degrees warmer. You can see there's some areas that are more than that. We can also see this temperature from the Argo floats that's at depth too. So 300 meters where there was also measurements made, it's about 0.3 degrees, I think something like that, warmer. So this is what's been going on in this period of 25 years. And so here I am, 2013, sort of similar, same hair, same shoes. And what am I thinking today? What I'm thinking is that we have warming oceans, we have more acidic oceans. We have atmospheric levels of CO2, as I said, at 403. We now know that this organism that I wasn't even thinking about in '86 is the most abundant photosynthetic organism on the planet. We also know that in our sunlit oceans, everywhere there's Proteorhodopsin that the bacteria are using to sort of supplement what their activities are. And now there's not a single student that doesn't use meta multiple times in every sentence, right? So we have metagenomics, metaproteomics, metatranscriptomics, metametabolites. We have meta-analysis of the metadata. So that's where we are today. Okay, so that's my unit of 25 years that I started thinking about. So let's start taking a few steps into the future and think about the next 25 years. So what I see happening in the next 25 years is an expanding access to the oceans. We've heard a lot all day about the ability to use a sailboat to get access to the ocean. There are people who will continue using oceanographic vessels, but people are using ferries, they're using cruise lines. I personally have done work off container ships, so people are using whatever they can to get access to the ocean. And what I wanted to tell you, though, today is about something you may not be as aware of. It is a big program that's going on within the US called the Ocean Observing Initiative. And what I'm showing you here is just a small subset of this program, showing some of the sites in the North Pacific Ocean where we have these, are creating these long-term observatories. So the one I'll tell you about just briefly is one in my own backyard. This is called the cabled array, and it is, so let's see if I can, okay. This is Seattle, this is where I live. This is the west coast of the US, and there is a fiber optic cable that goes from the coast of Oregon all the way across. It's like 900 kilometers of cable that goes all the way out to a spreading center where there's a volcano. There's also cable that comes out to the shore and is making measurements along shore. So when you have a cable going offshore like this, not only do you have power on the seafloor, but you also basically have internet on the seafloor as well. So imagine being able to put instruments on these cables to make continuous measurements. That's what's happening already, is that the instruments are running, and the data is not quite, all of the data is not quite yet available. It will become data available this summer, but I'm going to tell you a story about a small section of this data that is available. So, as I said, this cable goes all the way out to a volcano, and at this volcano, there are all these instruments that are outfitted on the volcano. Okay, now this is an underwater volcano. And so what I wanted to show you now is just to give you a sense of what it would be like to be able to have a continuous readout from anywhere in the ocean. This one has to do with a volcano. So this requires me to do a little bit of coordination. Okay, so in a second, I'm going to show you the earthquakes that are happening at this volcano. This is the outline of the caldera of the volcano, and in a second, I'm going to show you red dots where there are earthquakes occurring that are detected on shore. But I want to do something else. I want to, and I couldn't figure out how to embed audio within the PowerPoint. So I have to get out of the PowerPoint and start running sounds that come from the hydrophone that was at the seafloor, where you'll be able to hear what's going on as these earthquakes and the volcano is becoming active. Okay, hold on just a second. Okay, I hope that will start playing soon. Let me make sure I have it. Okay. Okay. So let's get this going. Is that starting? Yes. Okay, so you'll start seeing in just a second. You see these red dots? That's where seismic activity was detected, and the yellow is 4 hours later. So you start seeing this swarm of earthquakes. This is the sound that's going on there. In just a second, all these earthquakes that were going. And I find that so creepy to be listening listening. We're listening at the bottom of the ocean. Okay, I'm going to turn that off, otherwise I'll be distracted the whole time. Okay, and so what you could also see is that when this happened, you see the seafloor depth. There was a drop in the seafloor in this area because the volcano was expanding and then it went, and it didn't go into the water column, they don't think, it went underground. And you can see that change in temperature and the seafloor depth drop. So this is an earthquake. This is a volcano on the seafloor. But imagine being able to do that same kind of real-time analysis of any environment that is where you really want to understand. It's quite remarkable. So this is just a small subset of the data that's now public, but there will be all of this data becoming public. So where do I see us going also? Not only from this real-time kind of information, but I see that in the future, you won't be just listening to seeing earthquakes. We'll also be able to have this kind of real-time information about the organisms and about all the interactions that are going on with these organisms, because there will be a focus on sensors that can make measurements about these organisms. So this is a slide that a graphic artist made for me a number of years ago, and this was just a dream a number of years ago, that we would have sensors going off such a cabled observatory that I was showing you, and that these sensors would be able to make DNA-based measurements in a continuous way. You can see when I made this, because it was microarrays that were the instrument of choice at the time. Imagine if we take the nanopore system that Eddie's talking about, and we have it on a sensor, and it's continuously giving us a readout of who's there and what they're doing. And that information is coming back to the lab, where you can then interact with what's going on in the ocean. You can either do experiments at sea, or imagine that you program your drone to go pick up a sample and bring the sample back for those analyses that you have to do in the lab. This isn't crazy. I mean, I think this is where we will be. This is how we'll all be thinking in 25 years. And the last thing that I wanted to show in this time is, let's see if I can do this. So this is this beautiful image from Mick Follows, in which he's taken ocean circulation and embedded within that organisms that come from his computer. So these are computer-modeled organisms. And so these are the phytoplankton. So he has red phytoplankton, green, yellow, blue phytoplankton that you can see are distributing themselves in the ocean. Now, this incredibly beautiful image, these organisms live in his computer. They're hopefully representative of organisms that are in the real world, but they live in his computer. I see in 25 years, this image will have real organisms, and it will have the data that's coming from these streaming lines that's going in to populate these kinds of models. Okay? So I find that to be really a remarkable future. So let's continue a few more steps into the future. So we're in 50 years. In 50 years, I call this the manipulated ocean, because I think that as we get better access to the oceans and understand how the oceans function, there will be more and more pressure to get what we need from the oceans. And we already see the hints of this, where we are already extracting energy from the oceans, regardless of whether it's a sustainable, renewable energy like the windmills, or if it's fossil fuels. But there will be more and more pressure to get our energy from the oceans. There will also be a lot of pressure to get our food from the oceans, right? We already see that now. And this is an image I just took off the web of fish farming, offshore fish farming, that this company is producing as a way to be able to get the food we need. The other thing, it's been in the news of late, is this is from an MIT article. This bottom figure shows those areas of our planet that are experiencing severe water needs, right? This is the balance between human population and available water. And you can see that in all the areas where it's red, there is increasing freshwater demands. Up here is desalinization, and this is metric cubic meters of water that is being produced by desalinization. So this is currently, and this is what's predicted to happen into the future. So again, I see that our oceans there will be real pressure to extract what we humans need from our oceans, even fresh water from our oceans. And we see the concerns about this. I just went to the web and pulled off some headlines from the website. There's lots of discussion about rare earth metals, right? That's what we have in all of our cell phones and our computers. And will the future be that we actually reach economics where we have to extract rare earth metals from the seafloor? Where we'll turn to for phosphate? Is that where we'll turn? We've had many long decades worth of conversations about whether we can use the ocean to help regulate CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And finally, this was an article I read over the web about the fact that with sea level rise, there are different communities that are vulnerable to sea level rise, but they don't want the conversation to be about sea level rise because it'll drive down the value of their property, right? I think in the future we will actually be having conversations about this. Where will the oceanographers fit in? Well, the oceanographers will be very important in this to figure out how we can do these things in a sustainable way. Right, and how we can understand what's going on in the ocean to have the ability to take these kinds of steps. So, where are we in 100 years? I have two paths that I think, two extreme paths that we can go down. One I sadly call the forgotten ocean. And what do I mean by that? In the U.S., I'll give you an example. In the U.S., the middle of our country used to be the place where all the buffalo roamed, right? That's where we had grasslands, vast grasslands that supported the buffalo. The buffalo are all gone. They're in parks now, if we have any, and those grasslands are all used for crops and for people. So we lost that part of our country because of the demands of humans, right? And so how we move into the next 100 years really is determined by how we view the oceans. Will we lose our wild oceans, right? If you manipulate them, you could lose your wild oceans. Or will we instead recognize the importance of the oceans and the importance of the oceans for regulating the health of our planet? And that's what I call the beloved ocean, where we will protect our oceans and continue to keep them wild in whatever way we can while we're still having people use the oceans as needed. So I know this is seems like a little bit of a downer, but I like the path, the beloved path. That's the path I like. And I wanted to end by saying something that I hope you guys all realize. I think you know this. But what you've done in the TARA program, and what you've done with having a cover of Science, one of our most prestigious journals, international journals, the most prestigious one, you have images of plankton. Who was it earlier said, these are the organisms to study. And that's what you guys have done. You've brought these organisms and the importance of these organisms into the public realm. And it's these kinds of studies that really will keep us moving down that path of the beloved ocean, where we understand the importance of how they work. So you guys have done a fabulous job. And the ways that you connected with the public, all those kids coming out, it's amazing. It's really remarkable. So I'll end there.